Okay, so as promised, I'm going to give you guys some extra explanations for what's on just those basic PowerPoint slides so that I feel like if things are a little confusing, you at least have something to go off of. So we left off with where were we? We were at the cultural worldview function of language. So we have a few more functions of language that we're going to talk about. The first one is everyday social reality function. So basically we're saying that language is a mirror that reflects what's important or unimportant in everyday life. So the language that we speak, the way that we talk, the words that we choose to use are going to show what we think of as important in our everyday lives in our society. So we can look at a few different examples from a few different languages, and those are what's on the PowerPoint slides here. So we've got English. As a very individualistic society, it shouldn't be very surprising that self is very prevalent in our language. We have a lot of words that involve self because the self takes precedence over everything else. So we've got self-help, self-made, self-serve, self-interest, all these different kinds of terms that refer to you as a person and that sort of prioritize you. And we have so many of those compared to other languages because we're very individualistic in nature, and that's something that's very important to us as a culture, as a society. So we can see that in English, the prevalence of self shows our everyday social reality. There's also a very high rate of things focused on competition. So if we talk about things like that was a real game changer, you hit that one out of the park, or we got to go with this idea it's a real slam dunk. All of these are focused on competition, which shouldn't be terribly surprising either, knowing what we know about the United States or about other English-speaking cultures, that we very much prioritize competition. We're very individualistic. We want to be the best. And so we reflect that reality in the language that we're using. So that's some examples from English. To contrast with that, in Spanish, we have a very high prevalence of gender expectations in the language that they're using. So the gender expectations are reflected in the words that are being chosen in the Spanish language. So there's a high emphasis on gender and gender roles in language, and that seems to be reflected in the cultural expectations of gender as well. So you see it's a very much there are heavy cultural expectations surrounding gender in Spanish-speaking countries, and part of that is reflected by the language that they're using. There's also a large focus on respect and loyalty, and you see a lot of words that are reflecting respect and loyalty that are used pretty frequently in the Spanish language as a way to sort of reflect that everyday social reality. And then the last example up here is in Korean. The Korean language, there's a lot of ambiguity in the languages that's being used and the words that are being chosen. And that ambiguity just sort of reflects that there's a lot of ambiguousness in Korean culture, where it's a place that's very high context, right? We remember high versus low context. South Korea and North Korea are very high context. And so having a lot of ambiguity is very normal in their social relationships. And so you see in their language, there's a lot more ambiguousness in that language too. So it sort of reflects that social expectation. You also have more qualifiers at the beginning of sentences. So instead of saying, I'm going to do this, you would say, maybe I'll do this. Perhaps this will happen. So you sort of put some qualifiers in there as a way to reflect some of that ambiguity as well. So there's a lot more qualifiers, whereas we would just say, I'm going to do this. And in Korean, it would be more likely that we would say, perhaps I'll do this. Perhaps you'll be okay with me doing this. And it just sort of reflects that social reality. So you can see language is something that shows what to expect in the culture itself. So we use language as a way to sort of reinforce our cultural expectations. And you can see that in some of these examples. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. The next function that we'll talk about with language is the cognitive shaping function. So cognitive shaping function, basically, it comes down to the idea that language shapes reality. So the language that you speak, there's some support to suggest that the language you speak reflects or alters how you see the world. So you won't see the world the same way if you're speaking different languages, because the language sort of changes the wiring in your brain and makes you think a certain way. So we're saying that your conceptual reality, the way you see the world, depends on the language that you speak. So some examples of this, colors. This is a really interesting area of study, where if you don't have a word for a color, you just don't see that color. And I know that that's hard to wrap your head around, because you're like, well, the color is still the color. But if you don't have a name for it, it just becomes another color for you. So, for example, if you read like the Iliad or the Odyssey in ancient Greek, they don't talk about the sea being blue. They talk about being wine colored. You think about the color of wine as like a dark purple, and that's not the color of the sea, but they didn't have a word for blue. So they couldn't call the sea blue. They had to get whatever word was closest to blue, and that was going to be wine. So they called it the wine dark sea, and in English we would call it the deep blue sea, because we have a word for blue. And we see this word for blue actually is usually one of the last colors that we come up with a word for, which is kind of surprising, but we just, for whatever reason, we usually start with red. If you trace languages back, and when they came up with colors, when they started naming colors, red is usually the first one. It's the color of blood and all these kinds of things. And then we kind of filter down until we get to blue, which is usually the last one that gets developed. And there are still cultures now that don't have words for blue. They just don't have them. And what's really interesting, what happens when a language doesn't have a word for blue, is if you ask them so what they do is they take a bunch of squares that are green in color, and then they put one blue square in there, and they ask these people which one of these is different, right? They don't say which one's the green square, which one's the blue square. They just say which one of these squares is different from the other ones. And people without a word for blue can't identify that square is different from all of the other ones. And that's something that you just like, you look at the sky and you don't think of it as being blue. You think of it as being green, because you just don't have a name for it. So it's kind of hard to wrap your head around the fact that if you didn't have a name for a color, you just wouldn't see that color anymore. It would become something else. But that tends to be what happens. So that language shapes reality function, that's what's going on there. If you don't have a word for it, then it doesn't exist to you. It's just not there. It's not that you're suddenly colorblind to everything that's blue. You just don't see it as being conceptually different from green things or orange things or wherever you group it. So it's kind of a weird, interesting thing that happens with color, that if you don't have the word for it, you're just not going to see it. You can think about something like we have, if you think about red versus pink, we have a word that separates those two. So we think of them as being two different categories. In reality, pink is just a very light red, right? If you think about what makes pink pink, it's just red with some white added to it until it becomes pink. But we think of them as being two distinct colors because we have words that show they're two distinct colors. Red and pink are in different categories. But if you take blue and then make a light blue, we don't think of those as being in two distinct categories. It's the same concept as red versus pink, but because we don't have a word for that kind of light blue the way that we have a word for light red, we don't see them as being different. They're all just different shades of blue. And other languages will have different categories for those different shades of blue. They have a pink, but for blue, the same way we have a pink for red. This is getting out of control, but it basically boils down to, if you don't have a word for it, you just don't see it. So that's one area where language shapes reality. As another example, you might look at something like the ideas about the future. So in English, we feel like the future is pretty certain, it's pretty definite, and it's knowable. So it's perfectly fine in English to say, I will go to the market tomorrow. I'm going to go to the grocery store tomorrow. And that's something that no one thinks twice about because we think of the future as being pretty solid. In Spanish, if you translate that, you're not very likely to say it in such definite terms. You're a lot more likely to say, I might go to the grocery store. I may go to the grocery store. Because for them, the future is a lot less certain. It's a lot less sure. I know that between now and tomorrow, there are infinite number of things that could happen that could stop me from going to the grocery store. And so my reality says I might not go to the grocery store. I'd like to, but I might not. And so I'm going to use language that's going to reflect that. So the way that I think about the future will reflect the way I speak about the future. And then the way I speak about the future in turn reflects the way I think about it. So it's sort of a recursive process where each idea reinforces the other one, and it just keeps going in a spiral. So that's the cognitive shaping function. Basically, language shapes reality. You see the world based on the language that you speak. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is the group membership identity function. Basically, we look at language as a rallying point for people in a shared community. I can look at language as something that unites us, that bonds us. If we're speaking the same language, we probably see the world through similar lenses. If you think back to some of those other ideas about language with the cognitive shaping function and the reflecting social reality and all that kind of stuff. If we're speaking the same language, then we have similar thought patterns. We see the world in similar ways. We have similar expectations for everyday social interactions. So that language becomes a way to show that we share an identity together, that we're similar. And it's a great, easy to identify emblem of group solidarity, that we're in this together. We're on the same team. I'm in your in-group and you're in my in-group. It just becomes a really easy way to recognize people who are similar to you. It's also interesting that if you change the language, you wind up changing the culture along with it. So, and this is something that conquering entities knew for a very long time, that when you take over a place, so if you're France and you invaded England, you would immediately say no one speaks English anymore, right? That was just part of the invasion. If you were conquered, you kept people from speaking their native tongue, and that allowed you to sort of erode the bonds that were connecting them together and make them into more loyal subjects for yourself because they didn't have that similar connection anymore. So if you change the language, you're going to change the culture as well. And that's why historically, if you conquered a place, you took their language away from them. You outlawed it. You weren't allowed to speak that language anymore, because they wanted the culture to change. And that was the fastest way they knew to get culture change, was to change the language itself. We know that these tensions between different language groups can get pretty contentious. We've talked about this already, but French versus English in Quebec, there's a lot of tension around which language to speak and which one is the appropriate language in this area. We also have looked at Spanish, Basque, and Catalan as different languages in Spain, and these are very contentious as well. There have been armed conflicts in recent times. This isn't something that happened 100, 200 years ago. This is pretty recent, armed conflicts over which language we're going to speak. And I think just a few years ago, maybe in the Basque region, it's either Basque or Catalan region, they were supposed to hold a vote over which language they were going to start using. And the Spanish government came in and they were burning ballots and things like that. And this is within the past 5-10 years, I think this happened. They're burning ballots and not letting people go to the polls, not letting people vote, because they didn't want them voting to speak a different language from Spanish, because they know how important a language is to a culture. And if you are saying we're speaking something else, it's a very short jump from we're speaking a different language to we're leaving your country altogether, and we're going to have our own country. So we're seceding from you. And Spain obviously doesn't want to lose these territories. So they are very invested in making sure that people in these areas are still speaking Spanish to keep the culture strong with the rest of the Spanish country. So language serves a group identity function. It helps you to identify with other people in the same cultural group as you. And then the last one we'll talk about is the social change function. So we've talked about this already, that language can and does change. It's not a static thing. It's constantly in flux. It changes all the time. As society changes, language is going to change with it. So as we have developed these new technologies, we've come up with new words that reflect these new technologies. I'm texting this. I Googled how to do it. I took a selfie yesterday. These are all new words that have just come about in the past 20 years because we didn't have these things before. So as society changes, language changes with it. On the flip side of this, as language changes, society will change as well. This is a slower process, but it is something that takes place. And we know that if we're using things that are, not gender neutral, for example, we're talking about mankind and firemen and policemen and things like that. We know, even though those are supposed to be gender neutral terms, when you hear them, you don't think of men and women, you think of men. And so it sort of just biases our thinking just a little bit, that men's perspective is more valid, or it's more prevalent, and women is sort of an asterisk. That's like, oh, there's a subset of people, but they're not as important. And that's the research shows that that's the kind of bias that winds up in our heads when we're using these kinds of terms regularly. So if we want to change society to make it more gender equitable, one of the easiest things we can do is to change the way we talk, and that's to switch from things like mankind to humankind, because that will change our way of thinking. It changes our thinking patterns. It takes a while, so it's not a super quick fix, but it is something that will help to contribute to solving those kinds of problems. So when you see people proposing these kinds of language changes, it seems like we're getting a little nitpicky here, but the reality is that it does actually change the way that people think if you can change the language that they're using. So society changes, language changes along with it, and as language changes, society changes as well. We also have a couple of interesting things in terms of the social change function. The first is language borrowing. We see a lot more language borrowing now because the world has shrunk, so we can get different terms from different languages. I guess language borrowing is borrowing words from other languages other than your own, because you just don't have a good word for it in your own language. You're just going to borrow theirs instead. So anytime you've ever listened to like a song in another language and you suddenly hear a word and you're like, oh, I knew that one, it's probably a case of language borrowing. So a lot of people, a lot of different languages don't have their own word for the internet. They just say internet because that's what it was called in English, and they just borrowed that word from us. We will occasionally, like you have a word like fiance. Fiance is a language, it's borrowed from French, right? It's not our original word. If we were trying to say it in English, it would be your betrothed, but we just say fiance instead. It's the person you're going to marry is your fiance, not your betrothed. So we have borrowed different words from different languages and made them our own instead of just coming up with our own or using our own. We use one that works better in another language. And then the last thing on here is brand names entering the lexicon. So this is basically when you have a brand name that becomes really famous and it becomes difficult to separate the thing from the brand. So if I ask you for a Kleenex, you might give me a tissue, but we're going to talk about it in terms of Kleenex. That's a brand name, but it's become so synonymous with the product that we can't really separate the two of them. It's the same. So in the South, if you go and, oh, do you want a Coke? Someone might say yes, and then you have to specify what kind of Coke you want, because Coke is synonymous with just a soft drink in general. And then you have to specify which kind of Coke, which kind of soft drink do you want. I know somewhere like the UK, instead of saying I need to vacuum, they might say I need to Hoover, because Hoover is a brand of vacuum here, but there it's become completely synonymous with the act of vacuuming itself. And so that's a brand name entering the lexicon. It didn't enter our lexicon, but it has entered lexicons of other areas. So we do see a lot of that as well. And it's something that a lot of brands are really wary of. They don't want to become the generic, because as soon as they do, they kind of lose their ability to use that as their own term. So like something like Velcro. Velcro is actually a brand name. You wouldn't know it because everybody talks about Velcro as if it's just a product. It's not just a product, it's a brand name of a product, but it's just become so synonymous with that product itself that you'll see Velcro put on any kind of description that has something with Velcro on it. The word Velcro will be put in the description because Velcro eventually lost their ability to say this is our brand name. Now it's just the name of the thing. So brands tend to be a little bit wary of becoming, in the lexicon, because they don't want to lose that marketing ability, I guess. But it is something that happens, and we all have tons of examples of it happening. So we've got the functions of language. The rest of this we've already talked about in class, so you guys should be in pretty good shape. And I'm going to leave it here, and I'll see you guys for your exam on Wednesday. No, it's not an exam. I just freaked you guys out. I'm sorry. Your papers are due on Wednesday, and I will see you guys then. All right. Have a good weekend. Bye.